Hello everyone, and welcome to this Planet Tracker webinar. My name is François Monnier, and I'm a financial analyst at Planet Tracker. For those not familiar with Planet Tracker, we are a financial think tank, and our goal is to align investor capital with planetary boundaries. Today, we are going to investigate together the supply chain of the fish species humans eat the most across the globe, walleye pollock, also called Alaska pollock. If you eat fish, chances are high basically that you had pollock before, either in the form of fish fingers, surimi, fish burgers, or simply filleted. Why the focus on pollock, you may wonder? Simply because it offers a fascinating case study of the issues faced by global fisheries, and in particular, it demonstrates clearly how sustainability and profitability go hand in hand. Thankfully, I am not alone to discuss this complex issue today. We are very honored and lucky to have 4 panelists with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really great to have you all on board. In alphabetical order, with us today are Andrew Johnson, the Chief Executive of Marfish Eco Fisheries Consultants. Hello, Andrew. Andrew has a background in academic research and as a fisheries consultant. He has a keen interest in the impact of climate change on fisheries, a topic that is very relevant for Alaska pollock. Next is Jay Luger. Jay has over 30 years of experience in seafood, and he is the head of fisheries outreach at the MSC. Pollock is one of the most sustainable fisheries certified by MSC, and we'll therefore hear from Jay later. Craig Morris is the CEO of the Association of Genuine Alaska Pollock Producers. His role essentially consists in growing demand for Alaska pollock. He previously had a similar role at the National Pork Board and at the USDA, where he focused on the marketing of multiple agricultural commodities, including meat and fish. Hi, Craig, it's nice to have you on board as well. And finally, Andreas Osthagen is a senior research fellow at Fridtjof Nansen Institute and also at the Arctic Institute. His work focuses on Arctic security issues and ocean politics, and he wrote a very interesting paper on the risk of fish-related conflicts in the Arctic, and that is a risk we identified for pollock fisheries. So we'll start with a 10-minute presentation of the conclusions of our recent report called Pollockonomics, and there will be about 25 minutes roughly left for Q&A. You can already start asking questions using the Q&A function, and we will answer them later on. So, what is the key message of our report? In short, pollock fisheries are profitable because they are sustainable, but that profitability is at risk due to multiple factors, including high investment in vessels in Russia and climate change. What can be done to avoid that? Well, we will see how the actions of 13 entities are key to preserve the future of pollock fisheries. First, maybe let me start by asking you a strange question. If you had a spare $25 million, would you spend it on a 28-year-old unsafe factory trawler sold by a Chinese fishing company? The reason why I'm asking is because this is exactly what happened in December 2020, when a Russian fishing company called Sigma Marine Technology bought Caillou, the factory trawler you can see on this picture. And that raised our interest, and we investigated the transaction. And what we discovered was really worth a whole report. So we analyzed in detail this transaction and showed that it will most likely generate a high return. As you can see here from the waterfall chart, we estimate that operating that old vessel will generate a 35% EBIT margin, so earnings before interest and tax, which is really high. It's comparable to the tobacco sector, for instance. From our analysis of the Russian trawling sector, this is actually not an unusual level of profitability, though. What we discovered is that factory trawling typically, not always, but typically is a very profitable activity, with average margins of 30% in Russia, 30, and 27% globally. We made, of course, several assumptions to estimate the profitability of that vessel, but one of the key ones is that Caillou will be used to harvest pollock in Russian waters. Why? Because pollock is the key species for the Russian fleet, especially in the Far East Basin 1, so in the Pacific Ocean near Vladivostok, where the buyer is located. We therefore researched why the wild catch of pollock was such a profitable activity. The answer, in brief, is because pollock is now sustainably managed. Pollock is the largest fishery in the world for human consumption, and Russia and the US are by far the two key producers, as you can see on the left chart. Harvesting pollock is a profitable activity now because it is an abundant fish. Its harvest is typically done via mid-water trawl, meaning that the trawl does not touch the seabed, and bycatch is low, below 2%. As of today, pollock is not overfished. The chart on the right shows you the ratio between what is harvested out of the ocean every year and the maximum tonnage that can sustainably be harvested. So a ratio above 1 indicates overfishing, and the two main stocks in the US, the Eastern Bering Sea and in Russia, the Sea of Okhotsk, are below 1 today, thanks to reasonable fishing quotas. But overfishing, as you can see, did take place in the past. Let's see now what the outlook for pollock fisheries look like. So in the context of a strong demand for sustainable fish, pollock is actually a very attractive proposition. There are now 1.2 million tons of pollock certified by the Marine Stewardship Council on both sides of the Pacific, meaning that basically 3/4 of the global catches of that species are certified by MSC. And that share is set to rise as more Russian fisheries are expected to be certified in 2021. In Russia, strong demand for sustainable fish, coupled with an aging fleet, are driving an ambitious vessel investment program. The fleet is 28 years old on average, so the same as Caillou, the trawler mentioned before. And between 2018 and 2030, half of the Russian fleet is expected to be renewed. Now, the constraint for Russian fishing companies is that new vessels need to be built in Russia or a few neighboring countries. And of course, new vessels are much more expensive than second-hand ones, but they also are typically more sustainable. In the US, the situation is similar. Well, roughly, the fleet is actually even older, and its renewal needs also to happen domestically. The difference with Russia is that the pollock industry has not yet announced large investment plans, but in our opinion, it will likely happen soon. So in summary, you have an industry where high investments are ongoing or needed soon, and no increase in volumes likely, again, in our opinion. Actually, quite the opposite. In Russia, for instance, quotas are expected to be down 15 to 50% in the next 5 years. And there are additional clouds on the horizon for pollock fisheries. The first one is climate change. Recently, several marine heat waves hit pollock fisheries. You can see the trajectory on this map, the white arrows. The heat wave from 2014 to 2016 resulted in the near disappearance of pollock populations born in 2015. The second medium-term impact is a change in the distribution of pollock populations due to warming waters. It is expected that a third of the US pollock population will move northwards to the Arctic Sea or westwards to Russian waters. So on this map here, the green colors indicate where pollock is likely to be found in 2050. And of course, that change in distribution has massive implications. For instance, it led Russia to open commercial fishing for pollock in the Russian part of the Arctic Sea last year. It also raises the risk of conflicts around fish resources. For instance, in August last year, the Russian Navy conducted its largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War, according to the press. And in several instances, warships, warplanes, and the submarine were deployed in US waters. It was reported in the press that fishing vessels that belonged to American Seafoods, the largest US pollock producer, were, quote, harassed by the Russian Navy. Now, the reality is that the Russian Navy had warned the US that it would conduct this exercise, and it is unlikely that the fishing vessels were specifically targeted. But still, it provides a glimpse of what fish-related conflicts could look like in the future. And maybe Andreas will tell us more about it in a bit. And there is another risk for the pollock supply chain. It is linked to its reliance on China for processing. 60%, 60, of the pollock for caught in Russia is processed in China and then typically sent to Europe. Pollock is the most important seafood import for the EU, and the majority of it comes processed from China. And the margins generated for the trawling of pollock, as we saw, are high, and they are much higher than for its processing. So the question we have, and that's just a question / speculation at this stage, could Chinese fishing companies turn to pollock by pressuring Russia to get access to Russian waters? Now, just to be clear, Chinese companies are not currently fishing pollock in Russian waters, but they catch multiple other species, and the amount of these catches in Russian waters is rising really fast. An example of China's influence on pollock supply chains materialized at the start of this year, when effectively the near closure of the Chinese pollock markets for Russian exporters due to COVID-19 concerns about Russian seafood products led to a sharp drop in pollock catches in Russia. It still did not prevent a supply glut, which in turn led to a drop in Russian pollock wholesale prices. Again, this is just speculative at this stage, but still, to conclude on these risks, that means that pollock markets face multiple issues, including high investments in vessels, the impact of climate change, and the potential threat of a disruption by China, or rather Chinese fishing companies. So what could be done to mitigate this risk? Well, let's see. First, I think it's important to have a look at who has the most influence on pollock markets. This is subjective, of course, but I would argue that except pollock producers themselves, we'll come back on that, the two fishery agencies in Russia and the US and the MSC have considerable influence. The two fishery agencies of the US and Russia are very influential, of course, because they set quotas and policies. These agencies need to ensure that policies and quotas are set in a way that maximizes the sustainability and the longevity of these fisheries, but also local ecosystems. The MSC has great power too, given the share of pollock catches that is certified. In Russia, for instance, certified pollock fillets command a significant price premium compared to non-certified ones. And in our opinion, the key for the MSC, we can discuss that later, is to ensure that certification is a tool used to ensure continuous improvement in sustainability, and that can be removed failing that. And in addition, we believe that within pollock producers, some have greater influence than others. Looking at quota ownership on this chart here, We estimate that 10 companies or group worldwide control half the global quotas for this species. These are all the names that you can see on this pie chart, except Western Alaskan Native communities, because they get attributed quotas but often lease them back to other companies. So their influence is less high. But interestingly, most of these companies are privately owned. So what can they and their investor and lenders do to ensure pollock fisheries remain profitable and sustainable? Sorry, here are recommendations. What we would like to see is investors using the opportunity of the ongoing and future renewal of the fleet, so in Russia and the US, to condition funding to greater sustainability. For instance, by using sustainability-linked loans or covenants related to levels of bycatch, for instance. As a corollary, we believe that all vessels should be retired, not sold, to remove capacity from global oceans. We would also like to see pollock producers outline plans to adapt to climate change and publish the tonnage of fish harvested by species, because investors value transparency. Some companies already do it, including in Russia. And speaking of Russian companies, we believe they should refrain from bidding for quotas in the Arctic Sea, given how fragile the local ecosystems are. In the US part of the Arctic Sea, commercial fishing is banned, so this doesn't apply to American companies. And lastly, implementing traceability system is key to eliminate illegal fishing from pollock supply chains, which is still a non-marginal risk, especially in Russia. And that would also allow processing companies to increase the margin, as we showed in a previous report. So that concludes my presentation, which hopefully gave you a bit of context on the profitability and sustainability of pollock markets and the risk they face. Before turning to our panelists, I would like to thank our funders who financed the analysis in the report, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Finance Hub, the Oak Foundation, and the Levine Family Foundation. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. If you have any question, just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will answer it. So may I now turn to our panelists. To start the discussion, I'm just going to ask you, to each of you, one question to understand the current state of the industry, sustainability, profitability, the risk the industry face, and how it's responding. So let's start maybe with you, Craig. Craig, you are the CEO of the Genuine Alaska Pollock Producer Association. Trying not to go with acronyms here. Previously, you were the Vice President of International Marketing for the National Pork Board. And before that, you oversaw the USDA, Department of Agriculture, marketing efforts for the meat, poultry, fish, and other industries as well. So given your background and experience, can you tell us what distinguishes Alaska pollock from other forms of animal protein in general and other fish in particular in terms of sustainability?
You bet. I think there's really two things that attracted me to this industry. First and foremost, I think Alaska pollock is a product that's been hidden in plain sight. I think if you look at the attributes of the fish, the fact that it's wild caught, that it's caught in Alaska, at least for the US catch, it's mild taste, obviously, it has a wonderful nutritional profile, but then as you mentioned, the sustainability story. So I think from a marketing perspective, a product that is a relatively young fish, if you look around the world, it doesn't have the historic connection with consumers that, let's say, a cod or some of the other fish have had historically. I think Alaska pollock is one that's really been hidden in plain sight. And the more that we've communicated the sustainability story around the fish with the other four attributes that I listed, the stronger the demand response has been. So I think there's from a demand perspective, a lot of upside. And I think when you look at the sustainability story and certainly our industry's commitment to harvesting this resource sustainably, and then some of the research that we're going to have coming out here in the next week or two about the carbon footprint of our ability to harvest this resource so efficiently. I think there's a wonderful sustainability story to be told. And I think it's really one of the pillars, frankly, of our marketing strategy and what we've been doing to move the needle in terms of demand response, not only in the United States, but globally for the product in all its forms, not just fillet, but surimi as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Maybe let's move then to the risk that the industry faces. Andrew, you worked as a fishery consultant and as a researcher before, and you seem to have developed, I might be wrong, but a keen interest for the impact of climate change on fisheries. Not necessarily focusing on pollock, but in your experience, given you worked with different fisheries, can you tell us how, and sorry, it's not an easy question, but can you tell us how marine heat waves and other climate change related events affect fisheries in general?
You're right, that's not an easy question. I think I have two comments. First, the first is that basically there's two things going on. Climate change impacts the distribution of fish, so where you find them in the water, but in some cases it also influences their abundance. In general, with climate change, we associate it with warming waters, and that means that fish are moving north to maintain the same kind of temperature habitats that they would prefer. The other thing to think about in terms of the industry and people being ready to respond to climate change is, if you imagine that you were in a room with music being played and somebody was very gently turning the volume up very slowly, you probably wouldn't notice it very much. But if they suddenly gave a spike, you would notice it. And those spikes relate to, these things, these anomalies that we talk about in the news. But it's really important that the industry doesn't forget that the volume is constantly being turned up, but we don't notice it at the moment. And then when the Alaska blob comes along, which was an anomaly of up to 4 degrees along the Aleutian chain in Alaska, I mean, that's a huge temperature difference. Suddenly everybody realizes, oh, there's a temperature change, and it goes away. But we can't forget that it's still happening and it's creeping up again, and we're going to get more extremes coming in the future. So there's very little reason and utility in me responding saying some fish species will do X and some will do Y. But I think in general, the industry's got to be ready to respond to changes in temperature. And the response is either you follow the fish as they move, you either expect to catch less fish and try and increase your market price, whether that's finding new markets or value addition of the same, of the same product, or you decide to diversify your portfolio and catch other fish that are moving into your normal fishing grounds. So there's a number of responses that can be made, but it's definitely not an easy question to answer.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
But yeah, great to understand. So basically adapting, mitigating, or basically trying to respond in a different manner. Yeah. The other risk we mentioned was a geopolitical one, so something on which a planet tracker is not an expert, but in that case it seemed really relevant given the news, if you want. Andreas, I am turning to you now, given your expertise. In the Arctic, can you tell us about examples of fish-related disputes between states, for instance? And if you mention those, can you maybe point to the similarities or differences with the one I've just mentioned on pollock?
Indeed, yes. I mean, I'm no expert on pollock, and it's great to get information from the experts on this call on it, because it's a fascinating case study that is similar in some ways to some of the other case studies that we see in the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic, say, geopolitics or international scene that I've been studying for the last decade has often been dominated by these ideas of conflict in the Arctic over oil and gas or territory or shipping. And although we haven't seen that materialize for many reasons that we could have a different webinar on, we have seen conflict on fisheries. But the conflict is not, I mean, we have to distinguish what we're talking about, right? It's not states going to war and shooting at each other or crashing into each other as they did in the 70s over fishing quotas. But instead, we see breakdowns of negotiations over the total allowable catch. We see disputes over who gets the right to license or who gets the right to quotas, also impacting other relations. And a couple of examples closer to home where I'm sitting. I mean, the European North Atlantic side is the snow crab dispute that has emerged between Norway and the EU. The snow crab basically being an invasive species to the Norwegian waters, having crawled in from the east into western waters of Norway, where Norway and the EU disagrees on who has the right to license or to access this resource. We've seen similar dispute, or not similar, but we've seen a dispute of some similar character further south when it comes to mackerel, again between Norway, but this time Iceland, the EU, and the Faroe Islands, where Iceland is still not part of the total allowable catch for mackerel. And although we haven't seen a dispute with cod, which is a different case study that we could definitely discuss, because I think cod, North Atlantic cod, or the joint shared cod species between Norway and Russia, is an interesting case to compare with Alaska pollock. But we haven't seen it there yet. But there have been changes as well when it comes to the patterns of movement of the fish stock. And I think the commonality with Alaska pollock, as the way I hear it, is that although there doesn't seem to be any dispute yet over the quota management, there might be in the future because of the impact of climate change or changing climate or heating or warming waters, basically. So I'm curious also to hear from the other speakers how they see the quota schemes and how they might be able to handle that type of pressure. Because in the case of mackerel, we saw a change of the fish stock or the patterns of movement from fish stock moving further north, and the regime set up to deal with quotas amongst the states did not manage, right? It maybe not didn't break down, but at least it's not functioning as the way it should. And you know, it even lost its certification from MSC, which is then going straight against the argument of Craig, right? That the mackerel in this case, at least, is not sustainable anymore, and that's a liability, I guess, for the industry as well. But that's just one case.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andreas. That's I personally find this very interesting because it's not advertised, or it's not something that you see in the general press, all these disputes. So it was interesting. I know I said just one question, but you mentioned all these risks and all these examples. But is there, and again, that's a very hard question, but is there any way to prevent this risk between states? Is there anything that you saw worked in the past in terms of solving this conflict before they escalate further?
If I had the answer to that question, I would be the world's most famous international fisheries negotiator. And it does seem that each case is rather different, right? That the problem with the mackerel had to do with the actors involved and the fact that you had 4 different parties, one of which being Iceland, that has, you know, a massive dependency on fisheries, and maybe that's a not a way of solving it, but at least that's a way of explaining why some disputes tend to get quite ugly and others don't. I mean, you can go, I guess, back to the Gulf of Maine and the problems that were there between Canada and the US to find similar. And when you get local emotions, then problems tend to become heated. But and in the case of Norway and Russia and the cod fisheries, right, you only have 2 parties, so it has been easier to find an agreement. But what works and what doesn't work? I mean, those who study the international regimes talk about, you know, setting up flexible regimes or using third-party advice, right, for scientific data. Although in the case of mackerel, that is still being done. You use ICES, right, and you get third-party advice or recommendations, and still that hasn't really worked, because what you've seen in that case is that there's a dispute over science, right? The dispute has to do with not to get too technical, right? But it has to do with whether or not mackerel is there to stay or if it's just passing through. And then it becomes down to the biology of it. And then when you can't even agree on the science of it, then I think you're in in a deeper mess. So maybe that's one place to start, right? Finding a commonality there. At least that's what's been the case in Norway, Russia. But when it comes to the snow crab dispute, which is a different character, right? There it's a legal matter, and it's a matter of only a few fishers from the EU wanting to engage in this relatively new industry, and not being allowed to because Norway doesn't agree with the interpretation of the whole treaty system that is 100 years old. So difficult to compare, perhaps.
I appreciate that was a hard one. Sorry, but I thought it was very interesting. So maybe traceability could help as well in that case to reduce illegal activity, if you want. And just conscious of time, so last but not least, Jay, we talked about the MSC quite a while already. Maybe in your position as the head of fisheries outreach for the MSC. First, we identified MSC as one of the 13 entities that has the most influence of the future for pollock fisheries. You're free to disagree, by the way, on that. But around 3/4 of pollock catches are certified by the MSC. So the question is, of course, how does the MSC ensure that these fisheries, not just pollock, but in general, the certified fisheries by MSC, how do you ensure that they continue to improve their sustainability?
Well, thank you for that question, Francois. For those who are not familiar with the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC, as it's been described here, we're a global not-for-profit market oriented program for fisheries to meet a high international standard. Those analyses are done independently. And when producers like the members of Craig's organization, the Wild Alaska pollock producers, they can also be certified to sell that product into marketplace and use the MSC Eco label to bring attention to all the good practices that they do. So in many respects, the MSC organization is here to serve the partners, like strong partners like Alaska pollock producers, like pollock producers in Russia as well. It's a global standard. So if a fishery comes along and independently meets the standard, then we would consider them equivalent and able to meet the standard. But in answer to your question about how fisheries continue to improve their sustainability, there's a couple of key differences. First off, some fisheries like the Alaska pollock fishery has been in the program for a significant period of time. They were an early adopter. They used our program to demonstrate the key high level of performance of fisheries management in the U.S. system, and they were able to engage with the markets and perhaps grow some markets. It'd be more a question for Craig, but certainly engage with some markets that are focused on sustainability. And over time, their scores in the MSC system, every 5 years, they're obligated to be recertified. Over time, their scores have improved. So there's a lot of practice inside well-managed fisheries, and a lot of improvements that well-managed fisheries undertake on their own right, and as they proceed with new certifications, then they score better, and so they can be deemed to be, shall we say, more sustainable if that's on a gradient. But nevertheless, in the MSC system, it's binary. You're either pass the standard or you're not at the current time. The other thing I'd like to mention is that when MSC does in terms of making sure that fisheries improve, when MSC when a fishery comes forward and is certified by the independent CAB, certification conformity assessment body, it's not a snapshot view of what the fishery is doing. It's actually the entire marine management system, the management system of that agency that's managing the fishery, that is being tested and meets the standard. The fishery has to have built-in mechanisms to handle the natural fluctuations of these wild fish stocks. Climate change is, to put not too fine a point on it, is merely an exceptional version of some of those fluctuations, right? Management agencies such as NOAA or such as the Russian Management Agency on the Western Bering and in Seahost are going to have to formulate their own responses, and they're doing so already. I mean, if you look at the NOAA website, there was a recent story about some collaboration between NOAA and some Russian scientists about this changing distribution of pollock in the Bering. I mean, this is what high quality, good fisheries management looks like. The MSC is basically here to help our partners on both sides of the line and the Bering Sea to demonstrate in a transparent way through an independent study that they're doing these things necessary to meet this standard. And on both sides of the border, Alaska has been engaged for 10 or more years longer than the Russian pollock fisheries, but on both sides of the border, they meet the standard. They're high quality management agencies that are going to tackle these challenges, Francois.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the answer. That's great. And we also had, in the meantime, quite a few questions from the audience. I believe probably the best way would be to merge two questions. One of them is, are there good alternatives in terms of use of product, flavor, and market price for Alaska pollock? Now, I'm conscious, Craig, that your job is to grow demand for Alaska pollock, but I cannot resist asking you directly what would be a good alternative. I can whisper that probably Pacific cod might be a candidate, but would you have any view on that? If you prefer not to comment, I would understand.
No, I think it's a great question. I think it nests into what Jay said in terms of what the MSC does. And there's another question in here about, what are other seafood species that are sustainably managed like pollock? And I think the construct that we have in Alaska between the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is frankly one that we should be really proud of and how it's operated. And so I think really any seafood product that's produced under that system, consumers can have confidence they are produced in a sustainable manner. Virtually all of those products do enjoy MSC certification. And so if I was going to look at good alternatives, obviously I would look at the other whitefish species that come out of that construct. Obviously Alaska pollock has a scale that no other wild caught fishery can match in terms of that. But there are wonderful whitefish products that come out of that system that obviously we're very proud to partner with as well.
That's an interesting, yeah, thank you very much. And as a follow-up maybe to that, something that I've seen online is that basically you have Alaska pollock, which is effectively the largest species in terms of catch, as if you exclude anchoveta, which is not really for human consumption. How can something that is so vast in scale be sustainable? Just in terms of basic definition of sustainability, does that, how could you explain that? That's not just a question for you, Craig, but maybe for Jay or for everyone, if you have any views on that. And
well,
sorry, I was just saying, and to link it to that, another question that I'm seeing is whether panelists can think of other seafood species that are sustainably managed by like pollock. Because pollock is often quoted as the most sustainably managed within MSC, if I'm not wrong. Maybe by offering another example of seafood species managed by the certified by the MSC, we would understand better maybe this element of scale versus sustainability. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's actually a good question. We get it all the time because MSC is viewed upon occasion as a purview of large fisheries that supply global markets, but there's quite a wide range of fisheries that are in the MSC program. The whitefish fisheries, the fisheries with white flesh that largely sell into this value-added market that Craig's partners sell into his members, that category of whitefish tends to be very nicely coalesced populations and biomass and fishable areas, and and so it lends itself to a more industrial approach. But there are other whitefish fisheries that are smaller across the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere. Some of the competition that Craig's members might face would be a hoki fishery either in Argentina or down in New Zealand. These are fisheries that have been engaged in the MSC program for quite some time as well, and if their management system is able to meet the standard as they can do in many cases, then yeah, that's another example of other whitefish fisheries. Craig mentioned earlier that one of the better known species, which is cod, because in the U.S., New England was built on cod, they say, in many respects, right? In parts of Norway, cod is culturally important to the sustaining the population, sustaining the culture, and many places around the world actually, because of the salted cod from centuries or a century and a half to two, almost 3 centuries ago. The geopolitics were mattering back then, and as exploration countries fished across the world, Europeans were fishing in off Canada in the 1500s and salting that fish and taking it home. There are many good examples of highly sustainable whitefish fisheries. And when we have a moment, I want to mention one other list to Andreas's list of the geopolitical areas on cod, because there is a problem brewing on cod, Andreas, and we'll get back to that in a minute.
Okay, thank you. Andreas, do you want to follow up on cod, or should we move on to the next question? If you have anything to say on cod, now is the time.
No, cod is king, as they say in my hometown in North Norway. But cod, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about Alaska pollock being marketed as the most sustainable fish stock in the world, because in Norway, I don't think there's even a question whether or not cod is sustainably harvested. It's just assumed that it is. But perhaps there's a potential there for cod as well to be marketed more as such. Because as Jay was saying, I mean, this is an extremely important fisheries for Norway, and the Norwegian government, at least in its foreign policy aspirations, and when he talks about the Arctic and how Norway is doing so amazingly well in certain areas, right? When they go out to promote Norwegian interests, the sustainable management of the cod stock together with Russia is always highlighted as the one sign that, even in times of sanctions and troubling geopolitics, we managed to collaborate with Russia on the cod stock. But I'm curious to hear what Jay has to say on that, though, because I think perhaps at least we haven't seen, at least not officially, that there's been any breakdown in negotiations, and they seem to agree every year on the total allowable catch. But there have been speculation, right? Because that the cod stock is moving, and more also of it is moving into the fishery protection zone around Svalbard, which then suddenly raises the whole can of worms with Svalbard and who has the right to do fisheries inspection in that area, which is a different seminar you could organize, Francois.
Absolutely. Well, in actual fact, Andreas, that was the reference I was going to make. With the changes in UK, Brexit, etc., and the need to update some of the sharing arrangements and how the EU handles those catches in Svalbard. That was the small little bit I was going to mention. That was certainly the current topic in cod. We haven't seen that yet in the Bering Sea. I think the climate change impacts are going to be the next level of dialogue, and I'm glad to see, Craig, I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of it, but I'm glad to see that the management agencies are working together on this future problem.
Yeah, and I think I would add, there was a little discussion about the interaction between a portion of our U.S. Alaska pollock fleet and the Russian Navy, and that was in no way, shape, or form a dispute over where Alaska pollock should be harvested. It was frankly more of a miscommunication. Obviously those are waters for the purposes of the United States to harvest Alaska pollock as a part of our catch, but those are also waters that the Russian Navy has the right to conduct training activities in, and they had actually communicated with the U.S. military that they were going to be doing that. There was just a breakdown in communication. So that interaction, although it did disrupt our fishing, obviously, and there were concerns, that we did not know about that in advance. It was in no way, shape, or form the Russian government or the Russian Navy trying to exert authority for harvesting Alaska pollock in those waters.
Thank you all for this. We have several other questions. I'm conscious of time, but I think some of them are very interesting. So I mentioned an expected decrease in quotas on the Russian side, at least for the foreseeable future. Strictly speaking, the next 5 years, let's say. The question is, what is the main reason behind this? So I could answer the question, but I'm certainly not a fisheries expert. And so if anyone would perhaps take the opportunity to explain how quotas are fixed and what is driving the lower forecast biomass that then will drive the lower quota, that would be quite interesting.
I don't know if Andrew has any comments on the science behind it, but I shared an earlier version of your presentation, Francois. Thanks for the opportunity, with a colleague in Russia, and my colleague questioned that categorization as being that the extent of that future drop. It's definitely, as we talked about earlier, natural fluctuations would have pollock rise and fall according to availability of productivity and recruitment in any given year, and that's what science does. To see a major drop of 50%, she was questioning as to where that would come from. They have not seen that. I don't think my colleague's female, that she would be suggesting that that came from Russian sources, but I don't know the full answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm afraid I would second that. I don't know where that figure comes from. Although the only comment I can make is, obviously the best fisheries management in the world, which we could probably all agree is Alaskan, I would say, in terms of forward thinking. You want to be responsive rather than reactive. So you want to plan for what's coming. And whether it's 50% drop, 10% drop, whatever, I mean, you want to make the decision before it happens, so you're not suddenly sat there with a fleet going out and there's no fish around. So, but it does seem like quite a large number to be coming within 5 years. I'm not sure where that's come from. So yeah, maybe we should get a Russian panelist on and ask them. That probably be useful.
And if you look at your nice color-coded chart about where at least that prediction that you showed us, Francois, where the pollock are headed, it would suggest the opposite, but I think, once again, these are studies yet to happen.
Yeah, the reference quoted in the report were the -15 were from the head of the fishery agencies or the deputy head. I would need to double check. I think I'll ask people to refer to the report. And the -50 were from a Russian NGO, whose name I don't want to butcher right now. But yeah, I'll point people to the report. Maybe we're already a little bit late, so last question, and then we'll wrap up if that's okay. We have a question here. I mentioned the topic of China. So right now, if you want, the US and Russia are not a duopoly, but that's the word that came to my mind. Basically, splitting 94%, I think, of the catches of pollock. Is this threat that I mentioned, that potentially Chinese companies would pressure the Russians to get access to the Russian waters and fish for pollock, is that something credible? And if so, would that impact the sustainability of fisheries?
If it's a fishery sustainability question, maybe it falls to me. I don't know, honestly, if there's multinational management in the stock, because this is, in my mind, a straddling stock. This is Russia and US managed, and they have arrangements in place that handle the straddling aspect of that. If Russia so chooses to share, if you will, the pollock in there under their control, that's to me, I think, is the question. And I think it's probably premature and quite hypothetical. Having said that, though, in some earlier, about a month or two ago, I had some dialogues with some Chinese colleagues, and they talked about 2 vessels being authorized to harvest pollock. I don't have any specifics of that. I don't want to get anybody exercising precise and think that's exactly going to happen, but it was mentioned to me personally, so maybe that's a precursor of what you're suggesting, Francois. But 2 vessels in the Russian pollock fleet would just be a mere drop in the bucket. So I think the current arrangements are going to continue for a while. The COVID stress around reduced production capacity, I think, is going to impact a lot of where production happens potentially, because of this price peaks that did happen this year, and lack of availability of some some product types. Those, I think, are the bigger issues, rather than China encountering or seeking the ability to harvest in Russian waters.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. There were other questions, very specific ones. We will answer them by email, but thank you for your questions. It's been a pleasure to have you all on board. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and disagreeing with me as well. It's always appreciated. Well, yeah, if you have any, if the audience has any further questions, feel free to reach out. And otherwise, it was great to have you all. Have a good evening, good morning, and we'll see you another time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.